Twice a year, the global sporting world absolutely loses its collective mind. The transfer window opens, and suddenly this sheer, unadulterated frenzy takes hold. You know exactly what I'm talking about, right? We're glued to the ticking countdown clocks on the sports networks. We're literally tracking the flight paths of private jets, trying to guess which elite striker is touching down in Europe. We're refreshing our feeds endlessly, waiting for those massive billion-dollar headlines and those incredibly dramatic, highly produced jersey unveilings. It's pure cinematic entertainment. Deadline day is this wild spectacle of frantic journalists and desperate fans, all holding their breath, waiting for the next global superstar to finally sign on the dotted line. But behind that glossy billion-dollar facade, behind the carefully curated social media announcements and the pristine stadium reveals, there is a shadow industry. A vast parallel market where the beautiful game violently collides with unchecked power, systemic corruption, and frankly devastating human exploitation. In this explainer, we're looking way past the hype. We are going to completely pull back the curtain and uncover the hidden, often ruthless reality of the global transfer market.
Okay, let's dive into this because I want you to just listen to this quote from Dani Alves. It completely shatters the entire illusion. Now, Alves is one of the most decorated players in the history of the sport, right? This is a guy who has won dozens of trophies at the absolute pinnacle of European football. And yet, his reflection on the industry he conquered is just haunting. I was happier when I lived in the countryside with my dad, because I didn't know how prostituted the world is. When you're a fan, standing in the terraces, singing your heart out for your club, it's so easy to view football as this pure game of passion and local pride. But for the players who are actually navigating this ruthless, multi-billion-dollar machine, the reality is often cold. It's highly transactional, and it's deeply unsettling. Today, we're going to look at the hidden human cost that sits right behind those sports page headlines.
Part 1. The Beautiful Game's Dark Secrets.
To truly wrap your head around the modern transfer market, you really have to picture an iceberg. We only ever see the gleaming tip shining in the sun, right? The star player, a huge smile on his face, holding a scarf high above his head for the cameras. But today, we're taking a plunge into the freezing depths. We're going to examine the massive, unregulated machinery that's operating quietly just below the waterline. But first, we have to ask, how on earth did we get here? Because football transfers weren't always this hyper-capitalist frenzy. For decades, players were closely tied to their clubs. They rarely moved, and when they did, the fees were incredibly modest. Then, the dam broke. The year was 1995, and it was the Bosman ruling. This was a landmark legal decision that allowed players in the European Union to move to another club at the end of their contract without a transfer fee. Overnight, it shifted all the power directly to the players, but more importantly, it completely commodified them. Freedom of contracts sparked an absolute explosion in agent power. Combine that with a massive, unprecedented influx of new television broadcast money, and the market just skyrocketed. Just track this timeline for a second. In 1996, the legendary Brazilian striker Ronaldo moved to Barcelona for 15 million euros. At the time, that was a staggering sum. People couldn't believe it. Fast forward a mere 5 years later, in 2001, and Real Madrid broke the 80 million euro barrier for Zinedine Zidane. And then in 2017, the entire system completely shattered. Neymar's 222 million euro move to Paris Saint-Germain permanently warped the financial scale of the sport. Top players were no longer just elite athletes anymore. They had become highly lucrative tradable assets with valuations that literally rivaled major corporate acquisitions.
Part 2. Heroes, Villains, and Betrayals.
And this brilliantly illustrates what happens when you mix that massive influx of money with deeply emotional fan loyalties. It brings us back to the visible tip of our iceberg, the intense, volcanic anger that erupts when players cross forbidden lines. Because in football, joining a rival club isn't just a career move. It's perceived as an act of war. Take Luis Figo. When he committed the ultimate, unforgivable sin of leaving Barcelona for Real Madrid in 2000, the atmosphere at Camp Nou when he returned was pure, visceral hatred. The crowd was so enraged by his perceived treachery that a fan literally smuggled a severed pig's head into the stadium and hurled it onto the grass as Figo went to take a corner kick. A pig's head. Or how about when Sol Campbell ran down his contract at Tottenham Hotspur to join their bitterest North London rivals, Arsenal? The backlash was absolutely deafening. Spurs fans were marching through the streets, hanging effigies of their former captain, branding him Judas. Then you have Carlos Tevez crossing with City divide to join Manchester City. City erected a massive, sky blue billboard right in the city center that just read, "Welcome to Manchester." It was a brilliantly audacious move designed solely to rub salt directly into Manchester United's wounds. And then there are the financial betrayals. Ashley Cole famously claimed in his autobiography that he nearly swerved his car off the road in absolute rage when Arsenal offered him a mere £55,000 a week, which prompted him to immediately pack his bags for Chelsea. Fans view these transfers entirely through a tribal lens. It's loyalty versus betrayal. To the Terraces, these players are traitors. They're mercenaries. But let's take a step back and look past the burning shirts in the streets for a second, because the psychological reality for the actual players is entirely different. Fans demand this undying, blood-sworn loyalty, right? Yet the clubs themselves operate on a ruthless, unfeeling business logic. Former Barcelona goalkeeper Victor Valdez once spoke incredibly openly about this. He talked about the immense, crushing psychological burden placed on players. It was a pressure so heavy, he said it made him want to walk away from all the fame, buy a surfboard, and just disappear into total isolation. Former striker Oriol Rira hit the nail on the head when he noted that beneath the glamorous Instagram bubble, players are entirely at the mercy of sporting directors and boardroom executives. Here is the dark reality. Players are routinely forced out of clubs entirely against their will. Teams can trigger unilateral release clauses to just dump a player on the final day of the transfer window. Just imagine that for a second. Imagine receiving a phone call at 4 p.m. on deadline day. You pick up, and you're told you have exactly 3 hours to clear out your locker, uproot your entire family, pull your kids out of school, and move to a different country entirely. Why? Simply because a billionaire owner wanted to balance a spreadsheet. Loyalty, it turns out, is very much a one-way street, and players are highly expendable commodities.
Part 3. Where the money really goes.
So, if players are essentially just assets on a balance sheet, what actually happens when a €100 million transfer goes through? When we read those massive headlines, we tend to assume it's a super clean transaction. We think the buying club just wires a massive lump sum to the selling club the next morning, and that's that. But the truth? The truth is much darker and far more convoluted. In reality, a mega transfer is structured heavily like a complex, high-stakes corporate mortgage. Take a player like Florian Wirtz with a reported valuation of €117 million guaranteed, featuring performance add-ons that could easily push the total closer to €160 million. Look at how this financial pie is actually sliced. The upfront fee? That's just a fraction of the total cost. That massive segment right there? Those are multi-year installments. That means clubs are carrying hundreds of millions in debt for players who might not even be on their roster in 3 years. Then you have the performance bonuses. This is money that's triggered only if the player hits certain appearance metrics, scores a specific number of goals, or, say, lifts the Champions League trophy. But here's the kicker. The pie is sliced even further before the selling club ever sees a dime of actual profit. A small army of lawyers, intermediaries, and agents step in to siphon off their cut from the total package. €40 million. Just take a second to let that number truly sink in. €40 million. That is the staggering amount the late super agent Mino Raiola reportedly earned just for facilitating one single transfer. Just one. It was Paul Pogba's €105 million return to Manchester United in 2016. €40 million for one signature. This completely highlights the unchecked and frankly often scandalous power of the modern super agent. Think about it. In almost any other global industry, representing both the buyer and the seller in a transaction would be incredibly illegal. But in football, through a practice known as dual representation, agents regularly play both sides of the table. They maximize their commission directly at the expense of the sport. Literally billions of euros vanish every single year into agent commissions and shadow accounts. It makes these brokers astronomically richer than the generational talents they claim to represent. And the cash doesn't just flow outward to these agents. It actually flows backward in time. When a massive transfer lands, previous clubs often hold a financial stake in a player's future. For example, when Jude Bellingham made his massive blockbuster move to Real Madrid, his former youth club Birmingham City reportedly pocketed over €6 million. How? Thanks to a cleverly negotiated sell-on clause. Additionally, FIFA actually mandates a 5% solidarity mechanism. Now, what this does is ensure that a small slice of every international transfer fee is distributed back to the grassroots academies that train the player between the ages of 12 and 23. And on one hand, yeah, this serves as a vital financial lifeline for small, struggling clubs. But on the other hand, it reinforces a really cold reality. These academies essentially act as shareholders. The human beings they developed are paying out dividends years and years down the line. Now, because there is just so much money, leverage, and massive ego on the table during these transfers, contract negotiations can get wonderfully weird. Before we descend into the truly grim reality of the market, we have to look at the sheer absurdity of some of these legally binding clauses. When German striker Giuseppe Reina signed for Arminia Bielefeld, he demanded a new house be built for him for every single season he played. The club agreed, But Reyna's agent forgot to specify the size of the houses in the contract, so for 3 years, the club legally fulfilled their obligation by building him a new house entirely out of Lego. You can't make this up. Then there's Swedish midfielder Stefan Schwarz. He actually had a clause written into his Sunderland contract explicitly banning him from space travel. Why? Simply because the club's directors found out he was interested in booking a commercial space flight, and they didn't want to risk their investment. And of course, the legendary Brazilian Ronaldinho famously leveraged his immense star power to demand a clause guaranteeing him the legal right to go out to nightclubs and party twice a week without facing any disciplinary action.
Part 4. Exploitation in the Shadows.
So, the crucial point is, beneath the bizarre clauses and the multi-million-dollar agent fees lies a devastating reality. As we dive into the deepest, darkest waters of the transfer market, the glamour fades completely. It gives way to a systemic human trafficking crisis that the footballing world largely ignores. You have to understand a deeply insidious practice known as third-party ownership. For years, hedge funds, private equity firms, and wealthy businessmen sitting in sterile boardrooms would purchase percentage stakes in the economic rights of young, impoverished players. These were usually teenagers, sourced from South America or Africa. When that player was eventually sold to Europe, the corporate investors pocketed the profits. They were quite literally trading human beings like stocks on a market. While FIFA officially banned this practice back in 2015, massive regulatory loopholes remain wide open today. Shady investment syndicates continue to strip players of their autonomy. These young athletes become captive assets. They are forced into a kind of indentured servitude where they are benched, punished, or strong-arms into moving to a cold, foreign league they absolutely hate simply because the hedge fund manager wanted a 20% return on investment.
And the blind, predatory pursuit of this profit leads to horrifying extremes. It's 2007. A dilapidated, rusted fishing trawler washes up on a beach in Tenerife, Spain. The skipper had deserted the vessel miles out at sea. He left 130 severely dehydrated, starving people trapped on board under a blistering sun. Among those fighting for their lives in the stench of that cramped hull were 15 young African footballers. They'd been aggressively recruited by a ghost agent. This predator convinced their desperate families that he was a scout. He promised them that these boys were on their way to Europe for guaranteed, life-changing trials at massive clubs like Real Madrid and Marseille. But it was all a lie. Instead, he took their family's entire life savings, loaded the boys onto a literal death trap, and left them to perish on the open ocean.
15,000. Take a breath, because I promise you that is not an exaggeration. That is the estimated number of trafficked youth players currently stranded across Europe, according to experts from the International Center for Sports Security. 15,000 kids who chased a footballing dream only to be swallowed whole by a vast, highly organized criminal underworld. Behind that massive, sweeping statistic are real, broken people. People like Suleiman Ouedraogo. At just 21 years old, Suleiman was lured away from his home in Burkina Faso by an agent promising him a lucrative, fulfilling career in Portugal. His impoverished family looked to him as their one and only ticket out of poverty, but the agent took his cut from a lower-tier club, pocketed Suleiman's housing benefits, and just vanished into the night. Suleiman ended up completely stranded in a freezing park in Paris. Picture the brutal juxtaposition here. While the Neymars of the world fly overhead in customized private jets, Suleiman was sleeping on a park bench in the dead of winter wearing nothing but a thin gilet to stay alive. He survived only by couch surfing and relying on a charity called Foot Solidaire, run by former player Jean-Claude Mvuman. Suleiman's heartbreaking words, "I have to remember that I left school for this," perfectly capture the utter desperation and the stolen youth of thousands of abandoned teenagers across the continent. Let's move forward and see how this builds, because this isn't an accident. It is a highly organized, predatory playbook operating right under the nose of football's governing bodies. Here is exactly how this trafficking pipeline works. Rogue agents infiltrate African and South American academies, flashing forged European licenses. They isolate impoverished families, convincing them to liquidate whatever meager life savings they have to cover fake representation fees and travel visas. If a player actually miraculously lands a contract, these syndicate agents swoop right in to confiscate their passports and their wages, essentially trapping them in a foreign land. And if the player gets injured, or simply isn't deemed good enough, they're discarded, literally abandoned at a train station without a dollar to their name. And perhaps the most sickening reality of all this is the sheer complicity at the very top. Elite European clubs often willingly turn a blind eye. They knowingly utilize these murky, unregulated recruitment networks in their desperate, unyielding hunt for the next Lionel Messi or Cristiano Ronaldo.
Part 5. The True Cost of Football.
When you zoom out from the individual tragedies of players like Souleymane, you realize this is a massive, systemic failure of global governance. FIFA, operating out of its pristine, incredibly wealthy headquarters in Switzerland, has historically faced intense, unrelenting criticism for a complete lack of transparency and an apparent, absolute unwillingness to effectively police this sprawling market. Now, what's really interesting about this comparison is just how stark the contrast is between the two faces of the sport. On one side, you have the product broadcast into your living room, a highly polished entertainment machine built on global marketing, billion-dollar brands, and the thrilling theater of deadline day. But on the other side, you have the reality operating just behind the curtain. An unregulated industry plagued by horrific exploitation, shadowy international money laundering, and a system that treats living, breathing human beings as pure financial assets to be traded, leveraged, and ultimately discarded.
So, the next time a record-breaking transfer breaks the internet and a smiling player holds up their new jersey to a roaring, adoring crowd, remember the unseen depths of the iceberg. Remember the agents taking tens of millions of euros in the shadows. Remember the 15,000 stranded kids who paid the ultimate price for a dream they were sold by predators. Dani Alves told us he was happier in the countryside before he learned how prostituted this world truly is. And that leaves us with one final, undeniable question to consider. Are football transfers still about the beautiful game, or have the players simply become financial assets? Thank you for watching this explainer. Let us know what you think in the comments, and we'll see you next time.